Chapter 6. Manure. Stile walked north, keeping a wary eye out for hazards, demonic or otherwise, and for something else. The land, as the trees thinned, became pretty in a different way. There were patches of tall, lush grass and multicolored flowers, and sections of tumbled rocks. And finally, a lovely little stream, evidently issuing from the mountains to the south, bearing irregularly northwest. The water was absolutely clear. He lay on his stomach and put his lips to it, at the same time listening for any danger. Drinking could be a vulnerable moment. The water was so cold his mouth went numb and his throat balked at swallowing. He took his time, savoring it. Beverages were so varied and nutritious and available on Proton that he had seldom tasted pure water, and only now appreciated what he had missed. Then he cast about for fruit trees, but found none. He had no means to hunt and kill animals right now, though in time he was sure he could devise something. Safety was more urgent than nourishment, at the moment. His hunger would have to wait. With a horse, he could go far and fast, leaving no footprints of his own and no smell not masked by that of the animal. He would become untraceable. He followed the stream down, knowing it was a sure guide to the kind of animal life he wanted. This was ideal horse country. Had he actually seen some horses grazing there from the treetops, or only made an image of a wish? He could not be certain now, but trusted his instincts. Magic confused him, but he knew the ways of horses well. Suddenly, he spied it. The semicircular indentation of the hoof of a horse, and safely back from the water, a pile of horse manure. Confirmation. Stile examined the hoofprint. It was large, indicating an animal of perhaps 17 hands in height, solidly built. It was unshod and chipped at the fringes, but not overgrown. A fat, healthy horse who traveled enough to keep the hooves worn, and was careless enough to chip them on stones. Not the ideal mount for him, but it would do. Stile felt the relief wash through his body. Now that he had the proof, he had not imagined it. He had not deluded himself. There really were horses here. His experience with the demon amulet had shaken his certainties, but this restored them. He moved over to the manure and stared down at it, and faded into a memory. 17 years ago, as a youth of 18, looking down at a similar pile of dung. His parents' tenure had ended, and they had had to vacate planet Proton. Tenure was 20 years for serfs, with no exceptions, except possibly via the game, a more or less futile lure held out to keep the peons hoping. He had been fortunate. He had been born early in their tenure, and so had 18 free years. He had fitted in a full education and mastered Proton society before he had to make the choice to stay with his folks or to stay on Proton. His parents, with 20 years cumulative pay awaiting them, would be moderately wealthy in the galaxy. They might not be able to swing passage all the way back to Earth, but there were other planets that were really quite decent. They would be able to afford many good things. On the other hand, if he remained on Proton, he would have to serve 20 years as a serf, naked, obedient to the whims of some citizen employer, knowing that when that tenure ended, he too would be exiled. But here on Proton was the game. He had been addicted to the game early. In a culture of serfs, it was an invaluable release. The game was violence, or intellect, or art, or chance. Alone, or with tools, or machines, or animals. But mainly, it was challenge. It had its own hierarchy, independent of the outside status of the players. Every age ladder had its rungs, for all to see. The game had its own magic. He was good at it from the outset. He had a natural aptitude. He was soon on his ladder, on any rung he chose. But he never chose too high a rung. Family or game? It had been no contest. He had chosen Planet Proton. He had taken tenure the day his parents boarded the spaceship, and he had waited for a citizen to employ him. To his surprise, one had picked him up the first day. He had been conducted to the citizen's plush estate — there was no unplush citizen's estate — and put in the pasture and given a wagon and a wide pitchfork. His job was to spade horse manure. He had to take his fork and wheelbarrow and collect every pile of dung the citizens' fine horses were gracious enough to deposit on the fine lawns. Homesick for his exiled family, it was not that he had loved them less, but that at his age, he had loved the game more. And, unaccustomed to the discipline of working for a living, he found this a considerable letdown. Yet it did allow him time to be alone, and this was helpful. He was not alone during off hours. He slept in a loft barracks with 9 other pasture hands, and ate in a mess hall with 30 serfs. He had no privacy and no personal possessions. Even his bedding was only on loan, a convenience to prevent his sweat from contaminating anyone else. In the rooming, the light came on and they all rose, swiftly. At night, the light went out. No one missed a bed check, ever. At home with his folks, he had had no curfew. They went off to their employers by day, and as long as he kept up with his schooling, his time was largely his own, which meant he would be playing the game and drilling himself in its various techniques. Here, it was different, and he wondered whether he had, after all, made the right choice. Of course, he had to grow up sometime. He just hadn't expected to do it overnight. The citizen employer was inordinately wealthy, as most citizens were. He had several fine pastures in scattered locations. It was necessary to travel through the city domes from one property to another, and somehow the work was always piling up ahead of him. Some of the pastures were cross-fenced, with neat white earth-grown wooden boards and genuine pre-rusted nails. These barriers were, of course, protected by invisible microwaves that delivered an uncomfortable electric shock to anyone who touched the surface. The horses were not smart, but they had good memories. They seldom brushed the fences. Stile, of course, had to learn the hard way. No one told him in advance. That was part of his initiation. He learned. He found that the cross-fencing was to keep the horses in one pasture while allowing a new strain of grass to become established in another. If the horses had at it prematurely, they would destroy it by overgrazing before it had a chance. Pastures were rotated. When animals had to be separated, they were put in different pastures. There were many good reasons for cross-fencing, and the employer, despite his wealth, heeded those reasons. Stile's problem was that he had to cross some of those fences to collect the manure from far pastures. He was small, too small simply to step over as a tall serf might. He was acrobatic, so could readily have hurdled the 1.5-meter fences, but this was not permitted, lest it gave the horses notions. The horses did not know it was possible to jump fences outside of a formal race, so had never tried it. Also, his landing might scuff the turf, and that was another offense. Only horses had the right to scuff. They were valuable creatures with consummate privileges. Thus he had to proceed laboriously around the fence, going to far-flung gates where, of course, he had to debate the right-of-way with horses who outmassed him by factors of 10 to 15. This slowed his work, and he was already behind. Fortunately, he was a good runner, and if he moved swiftly, the horses often did not bother to keep up. They could outrun him if they had a mind to, any time, but they never raced when they didn't have to. It seemed to be a matter of principle. They did not feel the same rivalry with a man that they did with members of their own species. Then he discovered the stile, a structure like a standing stepladder that enabled him to cross the fence and haul his wheelbarrow across without touching a board. The horses could not navigate such a thing, and did not try. It was, in its fashion, a bridge between worlds. With it, he could at last get around the pastures fast enough to catch up to his work. Now that he was on tenure, he was expected to take an individual name. He had gone by his father's serf name, followed by a dependence number. When the Proton Serf Registry asked him for his choice of an original and personal designation, his irrevocable and possibly only mark of distinction, he gave it: style. Style? As in elegance? The serf interviewer inquired, gazing down at him with amusement. A grandiose appellation for a lad your size. Stile's muscles tightened in abdomen, buttocks, and shoulders. This lad was 18, full grown, but to strangers he looked 12. The depilatories in proton washwater kept the hair off his face and genitals, so that his sexual maturity was not obvious. A woman his size would not have had a problem. Depilatories did not affect her most obvious sexual characteristics. He was fed up with the inevitable remarks. Normal-heighted people always thought they were being so damned clever with their slighting allusions to his stature. But already he was learning to conceal his annoyance, not even pretending to take it as humor. Stile, as in fence, Stile. I'm a pasture hand. Oh. He was so designated, and thereafter was invariably addressed this way. The use of the proper name was obligatory among serfs. Only citizens had the pleasure of anonymity, being addressed only as Sir. If any serf knew the name of a citizen, he kept it to himself, except on those rare occasions when he needed to identify his employer for an outsider. It turned out to be a good choice. Stile. It was original and distinctive, and in the context of the game, suggestive of the homonym. For in the game, he did indeed have a certain style. But best of all were the ramifications of its original meaning: a bridge between pastures. A style represented a dimensionally expanded freedom and perception, as it were a choice of worlds. He liked the concept. With experience, he became more proficient. Every clod of dung he overlooked was a mark against him, a sure route to ridicule by the other hands, all of whom were larger, if not older than he, and had more seniority. In a society of workers who had no individual rights not relating to their jobs, the nuances of private protocol and favor became potent. Stile, 2 clods in the buckwheat pasture, the foreman would announce grimly as he made his daily review of demerits, and the group would snigger discreetly. And Stile would be low man on the farm totem for the next day. He was low man quite often in the early weeks. Other hands would accidentally shove him, and if he resisted, he received a reprimand for roughhousing that put him low for another day. For, except in egregious cases, the higher man on the totem was always right, and when it was one serf's word against another's, the low man lost. The foreman, basically a fair man, honored this convention scrupulously. He was competent, the only serf on the farm with actual power, and the only one granted the privilege of partial anonymity. His title was used instead of his name. He never overstepped his prerogatives or permitted others to. There came one day when Stile had not fouled up. A hulking youth named Shingle was low for the day, and Shingle brushed Stile roughly on the path to the service area. Stile drew on his game proficiency and ducked while his foot flung out, accidentally sending Shingle crashing into the barn wall. Furious, Shingle charged him, fists swinging, and Stile dropped to the ground, put his foot in the man's stomach, hauled on one arm, and flipped him through the air to land on the lush green turf so hard his body gouged it. Shingle's breath was knocked out, and the other hand stood amazed. The foreman arrived. "What happened here?" he demanded. "An accident," the others informed him, smirking innocently. "Shingle fell over Stile." The foreman squinted appraisingly at Stile, who stood with eyes downcast, knowing this meant trouble, expecting to receive the ridicule of the group again. Fighting was forbidden on these premises. Out came the clipboard the foreman always carried. "Shingle, one gouge in turf," the foreman said, and almost smiled as the group sniggered. For Shingle had been the man low on the totem, whose business it had been to avoid trouble. He was, by definition, wrong. The foreman turned to Stile. "Accidents will happen, but in future you will report to the recreation room for practice in your martial arts, Stile." He departed on his rounds. Stile only gained 1 day clear of the low totem, officially. For that day he overlooked another dropping. But he had traveled considerably higher in the estimate of his peers. They had not known he was into martial art. In turn, he remembered how they had stood by him, honoring the convention, laughing this time at their other fellow. Stile had won, by the tacit rules. The others had seemed to be against him only because he had been low totem, not because he was new or small. That was a supremely warming realization. After that, Stile began to make friends. He had held himself aloof, unconsciously, assuming the others looked down on him. If they had, they certainly didn't anymore. Now when he fouled up, and they snickered, it was friendly, almost rueful. Even Shingle, nose out of joint because the episode, never made an issue of it. He too abided by the rules, and he had lost fairly. Meanwhile, Stile was becoming adept at spotting horse manure. Horses tended to deposit their solid loads in semi-private places, in contrast to their liquid ones. Liquid went anywhere at all, sometimes even on their food. But solids were always well away from eating, grazing, or resting areas. This made the piles more challenging to find. Missing piles tended to put him low on the totem. Consequently, Stile had considerable incentive to improve his performance. He developed an extremely sharp eye for horse manure. His nose was not much help, for horses had mild refuse, unlike pigs or chickens. Never unpleasant, its odor faded quickly. If left a few days, God forbid, it could even sprout grass from undigested grains, for the digestion of horses was less sophisticated than that of cows. Horses were adapted to running, and their structure and heat dissipation mechanism and digestion reflected this. So Stile's nose availed only when he was in the near vicinity of a find. Yet sight was not the whole answer either, for the piles could be concealed in copses of trees or amidst bushes. Sometimes he found chunks of it in the foliage of low-springing branches. There was also the problem of rain, artificial, of course, here in the domes, that wet down the manure and tended to flatten and blend it with its surroundings. Even when everything was ideal, manure seemed to be able to disappear when he was in the vicinity, only to reappear when the foreman checked. It was so easy to overlook a pile on the left while collecting one on the right. Stile's instincts for manure sharpened to the point of near perfection. He could spade a full pile into his barrow with one scoop and heave, not missing a chunk. He learned the favorite deposit sites of the horses and checked there first. Sometimes he even beat the artificial flies there. He could look at a section of pasture and tell by the lay of it whether a horse would want to contribute. Yet, when he had mastered his job, it grew boring. Stile was bright, very bright. People tended to assume that small stature meant small intelligence, but it was not true. The work became stultifying. Had he mastered calculus and terrestrial ecology and aspects of quantum physics merely to fling dung for 20 years? Call him the king of dung. Why had the citizens snapped him up so quickly only to throw him away on this? But citizens were all powerful on Proton. They did not answer to serfs for their actions. Stile could neither complain nor change employers. His rights in the matter extended only to accepting proffered employment or suffering premature termination of tenure. If he wanted to remain on planet Proton, he obeyed the system. He spaded dung. Often while at work he watched the horses, covertly, lest he seemed to be malingering. There was Sonny, a small, handsome paint hackney with large ears, used for training new riders, though he had no proper trot. Simcoe Cloud, an Appaloosa gelding 16 hands high, with a pretty blanket, but too large a head. Navajo, a fine quarter horse, dominant in her pasture, though she was a mare. In another pasture was Misty, a gray, plump Tennessee walker with a will of her own, and her companion Sky Blue, only 14 hands high and over 20 years old. Blue was a former harness racer, well trained but shy despite her graying head. There was Cricket, also graying, verging on white. There were, according to the dictates of horse registry, no white horses. A horse that looked white was either albino or registered gray. Thus the joke. What color was George Washington's white horse? Gray. There constituted Stile's world during much of his working time. He came to know them all, from a moderate distance, from Shetland pony to massive draft horse. He longed to associate more closely with them, to pat them, brush them, walk them, but that was the prerogative of the stable hands, fiercely guarded. Stile was only a pasture hand, never allowed to get overly familiar with the stock. On many days his closest approach to a living horse was its manure. Yet from that necessary distance, what beauty! There was a peculiar grace to a horse, any horse. The power of the muscles, the spring of the ankles, the alertness of the ears, the constant swishing of the tail. There were no natural flies here, so android flies were provided that made loud buzzing sounds and swooped around the horses, just to provide exercise for those tails. Stile loved to watch the tails, perhaps the prettiest thing about any horse except for the manes. On occasion he saw a visiting horse with a red ribbon tied in the tail, the signal of an animal that kicked. If a pasture or stable hand got kicked, he was punished, not the valuable horse. Serfs were expected to be careful, not risking the horse's precious feet by contact with the serf's drab flesh. Stile made the best of it. He was hardly conscious of this at the time, but the extreme value placed on horses here was to make a profound impression on his attitude in life. These were not the racing animals. These were the retirees, the injured, the secondary steeds. Yet they were worth more than the lives of any of the serfs. Some serfs rebelled, secretly hating the animals they tended, but Stile absorbed the propaganda completely in this respect. The horse became his ideal. The horse, though confined to its pasture, had perfect freedom, for the pasture was equine heaven. If Stile had been a horse, he would have been in heaven too. Horses became prettier than people in his eyes, and though intellectually he denied this, emotionally he accepted it. Stile was in love with horses. Thus he became an avid student of the species. Not only did he study the nuances of mannerisms of the particular animals in his pastures, noting that each horse had a personality fully as distinct as that of any serf. During his free time he studied texts on horse manure. He learned of the intestinal parasites that might be found in it, the worms and the maggots and the microscopic vermin. Of course, there were no such parasites here, but he pretended there might be, and looked assiduously for the signs. He learned to judge the general health of a horse by its manure, whether it was being worked hard or was idle, what its diet was and in what proportions. Some horses had hard clods, some loose. Stile could tell which horse had produced any given pile, and thus was aware of the past day's location of each horse without ever seeing the animals directly. Time passed. One day, 2 years into his tenure, Stile actually spied a worm in manure. He reported this immediately to the foreman. "A worm in our manure?" the man demanded incredulously. "You've got delusions of grandeur." But they tested the horse, for the foreman let nothing pass unverified. And Stile was correct. A slow-hatching variety of parasite had slipped through the quarantine and infected the animal. It was not a serious bug and would not really have hurt the horse, but it was genuine. The larvae had manifested in the manure only on the day Stile noted them. He had caught the nuisance before it could spread to other animals. The foreman took Stile to the shower, washed him personally as if he were a child, and combed his hair with an available curry comb. Stile submitted, amazed at this attention. Then the foreman brought him, shining clean, to a small door in the wall of the stable. "Always say sir to him," the foreman said warningly. "Never turn your back until he has dismissed you." Then he guided Stile firmly through the door. Stile found himself, for the first time, in the presence of his employer. The other side of the barn was a palatial apartment with video screens on 3 walls. On each screen was a portion of a composite picture, the surface of a mountainous land as seen from the air. The image shifted in 3-dimensional cohesion, making the illusion most effective. The floor was almost transparent quartz, surely imported from a quarry on Earth, thus more valuable weight for weight than local gold. What affluence! The citizen sat in a plush swivel chair upholstered in blue silk, on whose armrest a number of control buttons showed. He was garbed in an ornate robe that seemed to be spun from thread made of platinum, and wore fine suede slippers. He was not an old man, and not young. Rejuvenation treatments made his body handsome and his age indeterminate. Though behind that facade of health, nature surely kept accurate score. Few citizens lived much over a century, despite the best medicine could do. He possessed no overpowering atmosphere of command. Had Stile encountered him on the streets, surf naked, he would never have recognized him as a citizen. The man was completely human. It was the clothing that made the difference. But what a difference it made! The citizen was facing to the side, his eyes on a passing cloud. He seemed unaware of Stile's intrusion. The foreman jogged Stile's elbow. Stile tried several times and finally choked out his announcement of arrival. "Sir?" The citizen's eyes flicked to cover him. "You are the lad who spawned the worm." The voice was ordinary too, amazingly. "Yes, sir." "You were promoted to stable boy." And the citizen rotated in his swivel chair, turning his glossy back, dismissing Stile. Stile found himself back in the barn. He must have walked there, guided by the foreman. Now the man led him by the hand to a cabin at the edge of the pasture. 3 stable hands stood beside it, at attention. "Stile is joining you," the foreman said. "Fetch his gear." With alacrity, they took off. In moments, Stile's bedding, body brush, and towel were neatly set up by the 4th bunk in the cabin. The stable hands were congratulating him. He was, of course, low man of the house, the boy. But it was like a fraternity, a giant improvement from the barracks. Only 4 to share the shower, curfew an hour later, and a cabin vid screen. Stile's days of spading and hauling manure were over. A new serf took his place in the pastures. Stile was now of a higher echelon. He was working directly with the horses. Reward had been as swift and decisive as punishment for infractions. At one stroke, the citizen had made 2 years of dung worthwhile. Stile lifted his eyes from the manure of this wilderness realm. Oh yes, he knew about manure. He had never forgotten what Dung had done for him. He considered it not with distaste or horror, but almost with affection. He walked on down the river, inspecting hoofprints and manure. Some of these horses were large, some medium, some healthy, some less so. Some did have worms in their droppings, and these gave Stile a perversely good feeling. A worm had promoted him. This region, then, was not sterile. It was natural. Flies hovered about the freshest piles. Genuine flies, he was sure. Species he knew only from books and museum specimens. No one policed this region. The old piles lay undisturbed, sprouting toadstools, gradually settling, dissolving in rainfall, bright green grass growing up through them. No self-respecting horse would eat at a dung site, so such blades remained unclipped. Nature's way of preventing overgrazing, perhaps. But Stile was appalled to see such an excellent pasture in such disrepair. Did no one care about these horses? They must be wild, uncared for, which meant that he would be free to take whichever one he chose. He might have to break it for riding, but he knew how to do that. Even with his injured knees, he could ride any horse. Only specialized racing required extreme flexure of the knees. For other riding, the legs were used for balance, for purchase, and guidance of the steed. There was evidently a fair-sized herd in this region. A number of mares, governed by a single powerful stallion? No, there seemed to be several males. He could tell by the positioning of the hoofprints about the indentations of urination sites. Males watered in front of the hind hooves, females behind. But there was bound to be a dominant stallion, for that was the way of horses. Geldings or cut males were no more competitive than mares, but potent stallions demanded recognition. That dominant stallion would probably make the finest steed for Stile's purpose, but would also be too obvious. Stile needed a good, fast, but inconspicuous animal, a non-herd stallion. Probably there were no geldings here, if the animals were actually wild, or a mare. A good mare was in no way inferior. Some of the most durable runners were female. Stile had ridden a mare named Thunder once, who brooked no backtalk from any horse, regardless of size or sex, and was herself a magnificent, high-stepping, lofty-headed creature. If he could find a mare like her here. He spied the prints of a small horse, no more than 14 hands, on the verge of being a pony, but supremely healthy. Probably a mare. There was something about the delicacy with which she had placed her feet. Every hoof was sound, and the manure had no infestation. She could run, too. He traced her galloping prints in the turf, noting the spread and precision of the marks, the absence of careless scuff marks or signs of tripping. No cracks in these hooves, no sloppy configurations. A good horse, in good condition, could outrun a greyhound, maintaining a velocity of 65 kilometers per hour. This could be that kind of horse. She seemed to be a loner, apart from the herd, drinking and feeding in places separate from the others. That could mean she was more vulnerable to predators, so would have to be more alert. Tougher, swifter. But why was she alone? Horses were basically herd animals. He followed this trail by print and manure. At first the piles were old, but as he used his skill to orient, they became fresher. It took him some hours to make real progress, for the horses had wandered far, as healthy horses did. As Stile walked, he wondered more persistently. What made this one separate from her companions? Was she, like himself, a private individual who had learned to value alone time? Or had she been excluded from the herd? What would constitute reason for such exclusion? Obviously, she may do quite well alone, but did she really like it? Stile had quite a lot of empathy for horses, and a lot for outsiders. Already he liked this little mare he had not yet seen. He did not, after all, need any giant steed to ride. His weight was slight, and he knew how to make it seem lighter. A small horse, even a pony, could easily support him. In heroic fantasy, the protagonist always bestrode a giant stallion. Stile could handle such a horse, but knew there were points to smallness too, just as there were points to small people. Here he was, abruptly at an aspect of the truth. He was very small for his kind. Therefore, he liked small things. He identified with them. He knew what it felt like to be looked down on and to be the butt of unfunny jokes. "Hey, did you hear the one about the little moron?" Why did it always have to be a little moron? Why did the terms midget, dwarf, pygmy, and runt have pejorative connotation? What the hell was so funny about being small? Since small people were not inferior intellectually, it stood to reason that smallness was a net asset, a better value pound for pound. So why didn't he really believe it? He should not choose a horse because it was small, but because it was the best mount for his purpose. Yet, subjectively, Stile's irate chain of thought was interrupted by the sight of his objective. There she stood, as pretty a little mare as he had ever seen. Her coat was glossy black, except for white socks on her hind feet, one rising higher than the other. Her mane fell to the right side, ebony sleek, and her tail was like the tresses of a beautiful woman. Her hooves glistened like pearl, dainty and perfectly formed. She had a Roman nose, convex rather than straight or concave, but in nice proportion, and her horn was a spiraled marvel of ivory symmetry. Her what? Stile actually blinked and rubbed his eyes. He only succeeded in blurring his vision, but what he saw was no trick of the light. He had found a unicorn.